much for coming. This has actually been sort of not far off the average attendance. We've averaged about 25 or so per event so far. It's not the sexiest of subjects, and I appreciate that. That's why I really appreciate you coming. But that aside, it's my opinion, and it is just a personal opinion, this is quite possibly the most important subject I've ever picked on to discuss, because it's right here, it's right now. And as you know, if you're familiar with my work, you'll be aware that normally I'm looking at what's coming down the pipe in 5, 10, 20 more years beyond. But here I'm talking about something that is pretty much right on top of us, and that's why I changed my original plans for 2013 and decided that I really had to focus on this particular issue. So what I'm going to do through the evening, and we'll split the evening into two, so I won't keep you sitting around too long so that you can pay even more for an exorbitant beer. We'll take a break about 9 o'clock for about 15 minutes or so, and then the second half will be about an hour plus some time for questions. Okay? And if previous events are anything to go by, then you will go away from this and you will tell other people about it. And hopefully you'll tell them tomorrow, because I'm doing this event in Sheffield tomorrow. And then I think that I'm not really back on the eastern side of the Pennines for the rest of the tour. I'll be the other side over in Manchester. But as you'll see, that this area is perhaps, how should I say, a primary target. And yet very, very few people are aware of it. Because all the media focus has been on Blackpool and the Fylde Peninsula, and a little bit on Sussex, a little bit on Somerset. But it's here, it's right up all the old eastern Pennines coal seams that I think are the real targets. And it's a case of distract with Blackpool and then keep everyone thinking that it's the Lancashire issue, when in reality this is the real target. And you'll see why as we go through. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a bit the bigger picture for you, because I want you to see why it is that this issue has come about at this particular time, and who it is that's driving it. Because once you start to see some of the players involved, it helps to put some of the things in perspective, and maybe some of the things that are sort of a bit inexplicable. But when you see the deeper agenda, it'll fall into place. And why this is so important to us, just to really show you the core issue here. "64% of England sits above shale gas or coal bed methane." So the media is focused on here, for reasons that I'll explain as we go through, here, and to a lesser extent here and here, when I think this is the real target. And we just happen to be pretty much right in the middle of that, right here, right now. And yet, very, very few people are aware of it, and that is the deception. That's almost the brilliance of the deception, to keep people focused on another part of the country whilst they're really looking at here. But let's go back a few years. Let's go back 3 years. Because 3 years ago, I was focusing on another event. Remember this? The BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. And this was very significant for me for a number of reasons. Not least, the day before, I'd actually put out a newsletter stating that I had a strong sense that something was about to go down, something of great significance. And I had this feeling a couple of times before, and one in 2006 when I was in Chicago, and I've told that story elsewhere, and again in 2009. But this time in 2010, I really sensed that something was going to happen on April the 19th. And April the 19th is very significant in the occult calendar of those who think they're the rightful rulers of this planet. They got a bit ahead of themselves this year. They went with April the 15th instead of April the 19th. But April the 19th/20th is the day of sacrifice by fire, the birthday of Isis. And if we just go back 20 years, we look at the events that occurred on April the 19th/20th over that period. I'm just going to recount a few. Because in 1993, on April the 19th, we had the firestorm at Waco, when some 72 people, mainly women and children, were killed by being burnt because they were in the basement of the David Koresh compound in Waco, Texas, where the Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms Division had waited specifically for that date, or somebody had made the decision to wait for that date, because there'd been a standoff outside the compound for nearly 2 months. 2 years later, supposedly it was a revenge attack by a lone bombman, a guy called Timothy McVeigh, on the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Now if you look at the photographic evidence that still exists on the web from that particular date, most of the video footage of the news reports in the immediate aftermath have been removed from the web because they tell a slightly different story than the one for the official version, funnily enough. They talk about unexploded bombs, which is why the first responders weren't permitted to go into the building, because unexploded devices had been uncovered. Well, the Ryder truck bomb that Timothy McVeigh supposedly put outside the building was remarkable, because it appeared to have sucked off the front of the building, thrown it over the top of the truck, and deposited it 300 yards in that direction. When you look at the photographic evidence, you can actually see that what occurred was that the explosive devices were placed on the central support columns and, of course, blew the whole of the front of the building off. But Timothy McVeigh and his Ryder truck bomb were the patsies on this occasion. Roll the clock on to 1999. April the 19th is the day of the Columbine High School massacre. April 20th in 2005 was actually the day of Pope Benedict coming into office. And it was April 20th was Hitler's birthday, and it's the Queen's official birthday. Well, I had just had a sense in 2010 that something was going to go down, and I was holed up in a hotel room in Lisbon because I couldn't fly back to London because of a volcano that had gone off a few days before in Iceland, and was supposedly putting an ash cloud across the northern European skies. You should remember that period because it's the clearest skies anybody's ever seen in years. And Lisbon wasn't too bad either, but you know, I really wanted to get home. I was on my way back from having visited my daughter in Mozambique. So it was the morning of April 21st when I woke up, and I had literally hundreds of emails from people who'd opened my newsletter asking if the event that occurred the night before was the event I'd been talking about. Well, I was reading the emails before I even knew what they were talking about, because I hadn't caught up with the event. And when I first discovered that this is what had happened the night before, at 9:20 in the evening in New Orleans time, so that was about, it would have been about 2:20 in the morning European time, I was reluctant to say that this was the event, because there was no evidence to suggest that this was the event that I've been talking about. But it had resulted in the loss of 11 lives. But of course, fortunately, no women and children on this occasion. Well, it took me 7 weeks. 7 weeks to really nail down the fact that this was not an accident. And I focused on a couple of individuals. This guy definitely wasn't involved. This guy was the guy who was the most senior person on the rig at the time. In fact, at the time, he's retired now, but at the time he was one of the most experienced company men, i.e. the senior supervisors in the BP deepwater drilling fleet. And inexplicably, he was taken off the rig on April the 16th. And this photograph is of him giving evidence before the Gulf Coast Commission. And when you watch the video footage of him giving evidence, you can see and hear from the tone of his voice and the body language that he's not really convinced about the reason that he was taken off the rig. Supposedly he was taken off because his safety certificate was coming up for renewal, but it wasn't that critical, and yet the rig was, as we know, a bit of a rogue rig. There had been some problems with it, and this was exactly the guy that you really needed on the rig at that time, but he was taken off. This is his counterpart, because the company men on the rig work 12 hours on, 12 hours off. And so this was his counterpart, and he obviously would have deferred to this guy. Well, this guy was replaced by a guy called Bob Kaluza, who was one of the least experienced men in the BP deepwater drilling fleet. And I'm not going to go through the whole saga tonight, but there are at least 3 decisions that he made between his arrival on the rig on April the 16th and the explosion at 9:20 in the evening on April 20th that absolutely defy belief. And the ultimate decision that absolutely defies any comprehension is that 2 of the engineers from my former company, Schlumberger, were on that rig. And they were on that rig to run what is called the cement bomb log. Now this is the final test of the cement casing in the well to make sure that basically that cement is going to hold the casing in place once the well is opened to production. Now, as we now know, there were some problems with the cement, but nonetheless, the Schlumberger engineers were there to ensure that the cement integrity was absolute. And so when they hooked their equipment up and discovered that the well was kicking, which basically means that it was vibrating. Now, I'm exaggerating when I do that because the vibration would have been so microscopic, that's why you need instruments to be able to measure it. But once it is vibrating, that's it. You know it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better. So the Schlumberger engineers instructed this guy to shut down the well. I mean, that's what they're employed to do. They are the third-party, independent adjudicators of the integrity of the cement. They are trained to make these decisions. Fortunately, they don't have to make them very often in the course of their career. But when they do have to make the decision, they make it with absolute confidence because they also know that if they're wrong, they will never work again because nobody will have them on the rig. So either Schlumberger has to redeploy them or basically it's the end of their career. But consequently, I mean, because of their training, these guys know that when they make this decision, it is the only decision that can be made. And like I said, if they are wrong, I mean, Schlumberger actually has to pick up the tab for all the reparations to get the rig back on track again. But in this case, Bob Kaluza turned around and said, "Not on my watch." Now this is absolutely inexplicable. You know, here was an opportunity to shut the well in. He was being told that there was only one possible outcome of this, and that was that the well was going to blow. Now he may have felt under some pressure because, believe it or not, there was a whole bunch of senior BP dignitaries on the rig who were there because the rig crew were going to be given a safety award the following day. How ironic is that? Anyway, the bottom line is he didn't shut the well in, and the Schlumberger engineers were totally spooked because they knew what was going to happen. So it's a matter of public record that the Schlumberger engineers called their boss in New Orleans, who immediately understood the magnitude of the situation. And whether or not that Schlumberger boss in New Orleans called BP, we don't know. But what he did do was he chartered a helicopter and had the helicopter flown out to the rig. And it's, like I said, a matter of public record that the Schlumberger engineers were evacuated from the rig at 11 o'clock on the morning of April 20th. 10.5 hours later, the rig blew with a loss of 11 lives. Well, I immediately started to drill through the evidence that was available because, you know, thanks to the web, a lot of people were getting their accounts onto the web. You know, a lot of people who were working on the rig wanting to make sure that everybody knew that they had nothing to do with it. This guy, though, wasn't posting very much at all, but what was very clear was that this guy had some very, very difficult questions that needed to be answered. The problem was that when Obama set up the Gulf Coast Commission, which he instructed the Coast Guard, the US Coast Guard, to chair, the Coast Guard very quickly ran into a problem because this guy pleaded the Fifth Amendment, which is the opportunity under the US Constitution that any individual charged with a crime or suspected of having perpetrated a criminal offence can elect to say nothing on the grounds anything they do say might actually incriminate them and therefore, you know, they're best remain silent. Well, not only that, but Halliburton refused to identify the cementing engineer that was on the rig, and Schlumberger refused to identify the cementing engineers that were on the rig. So the Coast Guard realised that they were in a bit of a problem here, because it was going to be extremely difficult for them to get to the bottom of what occurred if this guy, the cementing engineer, and the Schlumberger engineers weren't available. It was going to be a bit of a charade. So the Coast Guard went to Washington and they asked the House of Representatives to initiate the process of passing legislation to give the Coast Guard Commission the power of subpoena. Now that means the power to demand that these guys present themselves, demand that Halliburton and Schlumberger present the persons of interest that have been identified, and of course demand that they actually answer any question that the Coast Guard put to them. Well, that should seem like a no-brainer, because obviously it was becoming increasingly apparent that the magnitude of this disaster was enormous. And of course it was exacerbated by BP spraying nearly 2 million gallons of a very toxic chemical known as Corexit on top of the slick. And the reason they did this was to make the slick disappear, because BP's lawyers established that their liability, the company liability, was based on the size of a visible slick. So somebody had the smart-ass idea, well, let's just make it invisible. And the chemists came up with Corexit, which increased the toxicity of the spill 11-fold, caused the slick to expand because it did dilute it, but it also caused it to sink, therefore making it invisible. It's perverse, isn't it? It's really perverse. But even by June of 2010, the local residents in Louisiana and in Mississippi and northern Florida were already starting to feel some of the effects of this. Of course, the beaches were a mess, but people were starting to get headaches and get lesions, all of which, of course, was inexplicable at the time, but everyone knew that it probably had to be related to the BP disaster, because that was the only thing that had changed in the area. So it should have been a no-brainer that this piece of legislation should have whistled through and become law. Well, it went through the House of Representatives very, very quickly. In the final reading in the House of Representatives, it was passed by 420 votes to 1. Every Republican in the House for that vote voted in favour of the Coast Guard having the power of subpoena. Of the Democrats, only one objected, and that one was a very strange one, because it was Ron Paul. I can only assume that Ron Paul wasn't particularly well briefed on this, but anyway, it didn't really matter, because it passed the final reading in the House of Representatives by 420 votes to 1. So the next stage of the process is for the bill to go to the Senate. Well, it went through the first 2 readings in the Senate, and what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you the video footage from the last 3 minutes of the debate in the Senate, where we should have seen the power of subpoena being granted to the Coast Guard hearing.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged of S-3462, a bill to provide subpoena power to the National Commission on the British Petroleum Oil Spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and that the Senate then proceed to its consideration.
Is there objection?
On behalf of other members of the Republican Conference, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President?
Senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 442 H.R. 5481, a bill to give subpoena power to the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. That the bill be read a 3rd time and passed, and the motion to consider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This is legislation that passed the House 420 to 1.
Is there objection?
On behalf of other members of the Republican Conference, I object.
The objection is heard.
Madam President,
The Senator from New Hampshire.
I don't understand what is so objectionable. In the House, 169 Republicans voted in favor of giving the Presidential Commission subpoena power. They understand how important that is because this commission begins their investigation in the next few weeks. This should not be a partisan issue. I don't understand why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are turning this into a partisan issue. I find it unbelievable that after everything the people of the Gulf region have endured and that this entire country has witnessed for over 2 months now, that anyone is still standing with the oil company that caused this disaster instead of the victims who are suffering from it.
I hope the American people understand that this is a clear contrast between who stands on your side and who stands on the side of special interests. How is it possible that members of this chamber find it difficult when the House of Representatives, in a near unanimous vote, could say that the subpoena powers necessary for the commission to be able to get to the bottom of what happened could pass unanimously there, save for one vote, and yet cannot even proceed here? Cannot even proceed here. This isn't rocket science. It's common sense to most Americans. We need to fully learn the lessons of this disaster with a thorough investigation, not protect oil companies from having their negligence exposed. We need to get answers from BP and Transocean and Halliburton and everyone else, including the federal agencies, not give apologies to them, as I have seen Republicans suggest that we should apologize to BP for making sure that the residents of the Gulf region are held whole. We need to know the truth, and the commission needs subpoena power to get the truth. So who are you protecting? And what are we hiding here?
So do you appreciate what it is that you've just witnessed? What you have just seen is prima facie evidence that the US is controlled by the corporations. So it's a corporatocracy, which just so happens to be the definition of fascism. So here was the Senate effectively shutting down the Gulf Coast Commission from being able to get to the bottom of what occurred. Now, I recorded a presentation called BP Population Reduction and the End of an Age in early July of 2010. And when I put that presentation on Amazon, Amazon managed to hide it for nearly 7 months. It wasn't until February of 2011 that it was actually visible on my Amazon shop. And it was many phone calls and many emails before Amazon suddenly decided that there was a technical problem, and it was now resolved and it became visible. But the reason these two guys were in silhouette is because BP had managed to remove every single photograph of these guys from the web. Now I know that the photographs were there because when I was first doing this research in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the photographs were certainly there. Unfortunately, I didn't actually save them at that time because it never occurred to me that BP would manage to get them all removed. But the good news is that I can now show you the photographs of these guys. Well, a lot happened in the meantime, but if you Google Ian Crane BP, or BP disaster, you will find a whole bunch of websites which claim that I have been served with a $10 million lawsuit. Well, let me just put the record straight. First of all, it's a crock of crap. The lawsuit doesn't exist. But what does exist is about 20 or 30 websites that were created almost overnight, all saying that I and a journalist by the name of Deborah Dupre in the US had been served with this lawsuit. And the specific reference to me was that I had allegedly, illegally recorded a telephone conversation. Well, here's the actual facts. I did record a telephone conversation. But I'm not stupid enough to contravene Florida law. So there was a particular individual who I wanted to speak to, and I sent him an email asking him to call me. And I was actually quite surprised when he did call me. But when he called me and I answered the phone, I told him that I wasn't available to speak to him at that particular moment and that I would have to call him back in about 20 minutes. Had I recorded the conversation when he called me, the call would have been covered by Florida law, in which case it would indeed have been illegal to record that telephone conversation without his express permission. But when I called him back, the call was covered by UK law. And in the UK, it is not illegal to record a telephone conversation without the other party's permission, but it is illegal to share that recording with anybody else without the other party's permission, unless the other party is a judge. Well, the whole point of these massive emails being put on the web was to literally ensure that anybody Googling Ian Crane BP would immediately see that I'd been served with a $10 million lawsuit, and therefore to marginalise anything that I was putting out on the subject. And the purpose of that was because the particular individual concerned absolutely wanted to make sure that that phone call did not go into the public domain. So funnily enough, I have some very, very deep concerns and suspicions about that particular individual and what he was doing in the Gulf Coast in the immediate aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. My suspicion is that he was not necessarily directly on the payroll of BP, but probably through various agencies, and his role was to make sure that anyone getting a bit too close to the truth was effectively derailed. In the BP accounts for the post-Deepwater Horizon period, there's a line in those accounts which actually says behavioural adjustment payments, of which $52 million has been paid out. Well, this is hush money. A lot of that money has been paid to universities around the Gulf Coast to make sure that all the faculties in those universities do not take a specific interest in BP or in the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Because the funding that BP offer obviously is tied with clauses that ensure that they don't actually make any negative comment about BP's activities in the Gulf of Mexico. For individuals, if an individual started to speak to the press or get YouTube videos out talking about their particular experiences, then they'd get a visit from BP, and basically it was, how much? How much do you want? And with the money, and not everyone took it, that's for sure, but with the money you signed a clause basically stating that you would not in any way, shape or form criticise BP. This is behavioural adjustment payments. Now remember that, because we're going to see the British version of behavioural adjustment payments a bit later on tonight. Well, the reason that I'm able to show these photographs is thanks to the work of literally a very small number of Gulf Coast activists and a journalist by the name of Deborah Dupre, who actually appreciated the significance of this guy. And so the evidence, if you like, that I and the other Gulf Coast researchers had accumulated, the journalist helped us to ensure that that information got to the appropriate attorneys in the US who were actually representing people who were initiating claims against Kaluza. And in the end, it was actually picked up by the Attorney General's office in Washington. And these two guys have now been served. In fact, last November, they were indicted on 11 counts of involuntary manslaughter. So I'm just going to show you a very short clip of Bob Kaluza speaking outside the courtroom after he'd been indicted on 11 counts of manslaughter.
Sean Clark, and with me are Bob Kaluza and David Gerger. Thank you all for being here, and the first thing that we would like is Bob would like to say a few words to you.
I think I think about the tragedy of the Deepwater Horizon every day. But I did not cause this tragedy. I'm innocent, and I put my trust, reputation, and future in the hands of the judge and the jury. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Everyone whose life has been affected by this tragedy deserves justice. But justice must be based on truth. and this indictment isn't true. Bob Kaluza and Don Vidrine are innocent of the charges against them. Bob and Don did their jobs, they did them correctly, and they did them in accordance with their training.
It's an interesting doublespeak there. Bob and Don did their jobs, they did them correctly, and they did them in accordance with their training. Well, that would be the base point at which I would start the questioning from there, as to exactly what it was that they've been trained to do, particularly this guy. But Louisiana isn't exactly renowned as having the most robust legal system on the planet. So we've got a long, long, long way to go here, and the likelihood of it actually coming to court in January of 2014, which is when it's scheduled to come to court, is actually probably quite remote. And the real issue is whether or not Halliburton and Schlumberger can be persuaded to produce the relevant individuals, i.e. the cementing engineer and the two cement bond log engineers. And I would suggest that that is probably not going to happen. In fact, since this, Halliburton have had their health and safety, their senior health and safety executive actually state that there is a distinct possibility that Halliburton might have been partly responsible for what occurred. Not the engineer, not the cementing engineer, he hasn't said anything, but Halliburton themselves have said, we might have been responsible. Then what's really incredible is Transocean, who owned the rig, who had nothing at all to do with the drilling operation. They are purely there for matters marine because it's a floating rig. And they've said, well, you know what, we might have actually had something to do with it as well. Now, Schlumberger just haven't said anything at all. They've been very silent. So why do these companies now stand up and say, well, we might have had something to do with it, when in reality, I know they didn't? Exactly. It's this, it's protecting revenue. BP, in the space of barely 15 years, went from being a second-rate national oil company known as British Petroleum to BP and becoming the 6th largest oil company on the planet. And Halliburton, Transocean and Schlumberger are reliant on BP for a very significant chunk of their global revenues. So what they've done by putting their hands up voluntarily and saying, well, we might have been a little bit responsible, is they've helped to mitigate the BP liability. And of course what they've done is they've also made sure that they've got BP over the proverbial barrel so that they can pretty much guarantee that their revenues from BP are going to be protected. They will get preferential treatment in any bidding process. So this is the corporations just closing ranks. That's the way the global corporatocracy works. And of course, although BP got nailed supposedly for $42 billion in terms of damages on the Gulf Coast, most of that is actually paid by the US taxpayer because it's written off as an operating expense. So this is the corporations dominating the whole legal scenario here. Now, the lady involved, the journalist involved, Deborah Dupre, she, earlier this year, she published a book of her research and her experience in trying to get this information out to the right people. Funnily enough, she couldn't find a single publisher, despite the fact she is a published author, despite the fact that she is an established journalist, she couldn't find a single publishing house in the US to pick up the project to publish her book. So she had to self-publish it, and right now she's touring the US trying to promote that book. So the reason I wanted to focus on BP here is because of the players involved. And although this particular individual wasn't the chairman of, or chief executive officer of BP at the time of the Deepwater Horizon disaster, there's no doubt in my mind that when this guy was the CEO, and later the CEO and chairman of BP, he certainly made a lot of enemies within the global oil industry. That's this guy here. Today he's known as Lord John Brown. And here you see him with a couple of actors. One of whom would, of course, openly admit that he's an actor. And the US, of course, has absolutely no problem in putting an actor into senior political roles. I mean, they did it with Reagan, and they certainly did it with this guy. And this is the guy who demonstrated his intellect when he got the Senate of California to sign the bill that effectively condemned California to bankruptcy. And the way he got them to sign it was by making the incredibly intellectually demanding statement that if you don't sign this bill, you're a bunch of girly men. And they gave him a standing ovation and signed the bill. And within 12 months, California was totally bankrupt. But no, he can't be held out as an example, because every other state in the US, with one exception, is bankrupt. And of course, the one state that isn't bankrupt is North Dakota, and that is the only state that isn't part of the Federal Reserve. It's been outside the Federal Reserve System since 1922, but it was always considered to be, a small state, 300,000 people, mainly Swedish farmers, so it can operate outside the Federal Reserve System. And that was thanks to a visionary governor that they had back in the 1910s and early 1920s, who realised that the Federal Reserve Act was all about getting the states into debt. So anyway, he was the guy who took what at the time was the 6th largest economy on the planet, California, into bankruptcy. This guy is an arch sociopsychopath. He is currently sulking, of course, because he didn't make Pope. He converted to Catholicism, he didn't realise there was any more to it. But of course, he is on the bench right now, out in the Middle East. He's a Middle East peace advisor. No comment. But he's on the bench because he is being groomed, and always has been groomed, to be the EU president. Of course, he wanted to be the first EU president, but the puppet masters wanted to create the impression that the role of EU president is simply a sinecure. It's just a ceremonial role, just chairs a few meetings of the European Parliament, nothing really, too powerful. Yet, if you've read the Treaty of Lisbon makes it very clear that the president of the EU has despotic powers. And this socio-psychopath won't hesitate to use them. And in fact, I only need to give you one account to really put this guy's mental state into perspective. And you won't find this interview on YouTube, because anytime anybody tries to put it up, it gets taken down immediately. And this is an interview with Andrew Marr in 2009. Now, Andrew Marr's no Jeremy Paxman, but he sort of creeps up on the jugular and then gets the fingers around the throat. Well, the question went like this. It was, so Mr. Blair, how do you actually sleep at night knowing that some 500,000 Iraqi civilians, mainly women and children, lost their lives as a result of a war that we now know to be based on the false premise of weapons of mass destruction? And Blair's response is just so telling, because he leans forward and he says, Andrew, I think you'll find it was only 100,000. So that makes it all right. I mean, Andrew Marr was just gobsmacked. I mean, totally gobsmacked. He was actually lost for words for about 3 or 4 seconds. How do you respond to that? Without going, so that's all right then. But you or I, or any normal human being, would be mortified if we thought that we made a decision, and especially an incorrect decision, that had led to somebody else being emotionally wounded, let alone physically wounded, let alone killed. And yet this guy can justify that it was only 100,000. And of course, when he's pushed now, his standard response is, you wouldn't understand, it was very, very complex. Well, how arrogant can you get? So this is the guy who made this guy a knight and created this guy as a life peer. His track record at BP, if you just look at the pure business aspect in terms of profitability, was indeed exceptional. But at what cost? He spent his entire career at BP, having joined BP straight out of college from Cambridge, and worked his way up through the ranks, and at a very young age was appointed Chief Executive Officer. Whilst he was Chief Executive Officer, he had a very interesting mentor, who I'll introduce you to in just a second. But then latterly he was Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, and whilst he was in that role, he was predatory. That was how he took BP from being a second-rate national oil company to the 6th largest oil company on the planet. He was absolutely predatory. He didn't allow anything to get in his way. It was always through acquisition. And in fact, he created a situation where the other major American oil companies, particularly Exxon, were also forced to become predatory because they wanted to ensure that they could compete on an even footing with BP. So consequently, I think that there was an element of targeting BP for the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster as a way of getting back at this guy's predatory approach in terms of buying up American oil companies such as Amoco and Arco and dominating the North Slope of Alaska. But he was out of the frame a little while, about 2007. He actually announced that he would retire in 2008. He made that announcement in 2006. And what forced him to make that announcement was that although he was lauded over by the business media, there we go, the Forbes magazine, BP Amoco, the hottest prospect in the oil patch, but there were others who weren't quite so keen on him, particularly those that had an interest in health and the safety and the environment. Because this guy's mantra was profit before all else. An example of this is when BP took over the companies working on the North Slope of Alaska. And the American companies prided themselves on basically doing everything that they could to protect the pristine condition of the Arctic tundra. Because they knew that they had a responsibility. They accepted that responsibility. And they accepted that there was a cost associated with that responsibility. But when those companies were acquired by BP, BP took out all expenses that weren't directly associated with revenue generation, which led to major incidents, oil spills, particularly with the Trans-Alaskan pipeline. There were numerous spills during BP's tenure, primarily because maintenance had been cut. Well, the final straw was an explosion at a Texas refinery, which led to the loss of 15 lives. And then there were calls for this guy basically to resign and to be accountable for this appalling safety record and this appalling maintenance record under his tenure. Well, this guy has more Teflon on his skin than even Tony. And there was no sign of any legal proceedings being initiated. But he did not realise that he was starting to be under some pressure. So he announced that he would retire in 2006, but that he would retire in 2008. And a guy called Tony Hayward was lined up to be his successor. Of course, Tony Hayward was the guy who was found seriously lacking in his abilities to handle the fallout of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. But this guy, something else led to his downfall. It wasn't his mercenary, cavalier attitude in the boardroom. It was his personal life that led to his downfall. Because one of the Sunday newspapers, the Mail on Sunday, published an article in early 2007 stating that Lord John Brown was gay, which was probably the worst kept secret in the oil industry anyway, but so what? But the allegation here in the Mail on Sunday was that he was using BP funds, he was effectively claiming expenses to finance his gay lover's lifestyle. Well, the other allegation made by the Mail on Sunday was that he had actually met his gay lover on a gay dating website known as Booted and Suited. Now, he didn't challenge the the allegation over his sexuality. Smart move. But what he did do was he challenged the fact that he was financing his gay lover's lifestyle through BP expenses, and he also challenged the veracity of the claim that he had met his partner through a gay dating website. And he actually initiated legal proceedings against the Mail on Sunday. Well, the Mail on Sunday, like any newspaper, ain't going to run stories like that unless they are 200% sure of their facts. So when John Brown went before the High Court and stated categorically, on oath, that he had not met his gay lover on a website, he had met him whilst jogging in a South London park. And then the Mail on Sunday basically sort of fed his legal team bit by bit. They didn't let it all go out at once. They wanted to see how far this guy was prepared to go in terms of committing perjury. So for 2 weeks, this guy, on oath, lied before the High Court judge, stating categorically that it was an outright lie that he had met his partner on a gay website. Well, eventually, of course, the Mail on Sunday released the silver bullet, and he could no longer deny it. There was irrefutable evidence. And then he held his hand up and he said, maybe I was mistaken. And then he claims that he was doing it to protect BP. Well, it of course did accelerate his departure from BP, and there were calls, obviously not least by the Mail on Sunday, for him to be charged with perjury. But no court case was ever initiated. So I'm sure there was some kind of settlement outside of court, but anybody else who lied before a High Court judge for 2 weeks would have been charged with perjury, and of course it's an open and shut case. But here, nothing. Lord John Brown escapes that. So here we've got a guy who, in his tenure at the helm of BP, had been predatory in terms of acquisition, but he'd been mercenary and cavalier in terms of the way he ran these businesses by promoting this mantra of profit above all else. So having left BP under a cloud, obviously because of the revelations in the Mail on Sunday and the subsequent 2 weeks of perjury, the guy then sat on the bench making megabucks as a consultant. Well, he re-emerges 2 years later, or nearly 3 years later, when David Cameron comes into office, because David Cameron appoints him to a government position. Now this is almost sort of like US presidential appointment. In the US, the president of the country has the authority to appoint whomever he so wishes around him in the various offices. They don't have to have had any experience in politics whatsoever. I mean, in most cases they do, but they don't have to. If he wants to bring somebody in from the corporate world or from the military, he can do so. In the UK, our tradition is that the people on the cabinet are at least elected. They are elected individuals, and you can argue that that somewhat restricts the talent pool, but nonetheless, it generally works. But here, David Cameron appoints BP Chief John Brown, controversial choice for super director post, get this, intended to inject business ethos into government. Business ethos. From a guy whose corporate record left a body count that even might make the Clintons blush, and of course questions over not only his personal life, no real issue there perhaps, but the fact that his integrity has to be called into question because the guy clearly does not respect the legal process and certainly doesn't respect the oath of truth. Well, it gets better. The fracking industry, the shale gas extraction in this country, had been on hold since May of 2011. The reason being was because in England, 2 wells had been drilled, 2 exploratory wells into the shale gas in the Bowland Shale on the Fylde Peninsula in Lancashire, on the outskirts of Blackpool. And these 2 wells had been fracked. Now, I'm going to explain the fracking process in a second. I can assure you at the end of the evening, you will know more about fracking than almost anyone sitting in the House of Commons. And I know that because, well, not everyone, I haven't spoken to everyone, but those that I have looked at their websites, it's very clear that they have no clue other than what they've been told to spiel out. But those 2 wells that were fracked on the Fylde Peninsula in early 2011, in both cases they resulted in seismic events, i.e. small earthquakes. Now the first one was about 1.5 on the Richter scale, and that occurred on April the 1st, 2011. And a lot of people thought that it was, when they read it in the local paper, that it was just a delayed April Fool's joke. Well, the second one was a little stronger. It was 2.3 on the Richter scale, and that occurred in the middle of May. And the only things that had happened in the area to possibly cause this was the 2 frack jobs run by Quadrilla. So an immediate moratorium was put on the process of drilling and fracking, pending further investigation, because this was something that was going to be unleashed on a much larger scale, and 2 exploratory wells, 2 earthquakes might have some significant ramifications. Well, I must confess that I actually took my eye off the ball a bit after that, because I thought, well, that's great, we've had 2 earthquakes, that's it, it's done, it's dusted. Well, in November of last year, this guy goes to the media and states that he will do everything in his power to ensure that Britain is at the centre of the shale gas revolution. So this guy's not an elected representative of the government. There's a moratorium in place at the time. But here's the guy who's the business ethos advisor, standing up and saying basically that he is going to do everything he possibly can to ensure that Britain is at the heart of the shale gas revolution. And then 1 month later, on December the 14th, David Cameron announces that the moratorium is lifted, and basically looking at the various regulations they need to put in place, but bottom line is Britain is going to participate in the shale gas revolution. Well, the company that was responsible for the drilling and fracking in the Fylde Peninsula was this company, Quadrilla Resources. Now, all the companies, and I'll mention some of the names, I don't expect you to remember them because they're not household names. They are not companies that will just roll off your tongue, because the oil industry has learned from past experience that if you have a company that everyone knows, then there's a lot more focus on it. And I'll share with you in a second something that happened in Ireland that really puts that into perspective. So here it's all small companies that are on pioneer duty, if you like. These are the companies that have been tasked with being the pioneers to establish the viability of shale gas and coal bed methane extraction in this country. Well, Quadrilla is actually partially owned by a company called Coastal Oil and Gas. And guess what? This guy is the chairman of Coastal Oil and Gas. So here, talk about business ethos. Here's the guy effectively insider trading. Insider trading.